The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello and welcome to this Gold Money Podcast on Tuesday, the 22nd of January. Today I'm speaking to Mish Shedlock, who's a registered investment advisor for Sitka Pacific Capital Management, the creator and writer of Mish's global economic trend analysis website, and also a follower of the Austrian School of Economics. Hello, Mish.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be on the show, Andrew. I'm wondering actually what took so long, but here we are on Gold Money Podcast, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Fantastic. Now, 2012 marked the centenary of Ludwig von Mises's pivotal book, A Theory of Money and Credit. Now, most Austrians focus upon the money part of the book's title, and most of them are predicting dollar hyperinflation at some point in the next few years, whereas you're more famous for looking towards the credit part of that title, whereas you've predicted US deflation, at least in the short term. Can you explain your thinking?
Sure. My theory is that Austrians generally look at money supply. I look at money supply and credit. And it's the Austrians that have ignored credit that have got the situation wrong. Certainly, if you look at what the Fed has done, I mean, they've inflated money supply beyond what anyone, perhaps even me, could have imagined. Perhaps even some of the Austrians who saw this coming could have imagined. Yet what happened? Interest rates are at all-time record lows. Price inflation is relatively stable. It certainly didn't skyrocket up to the moon like anyone predicted. And so, why is that? And the answer is the credit market dwarfs money supply. Total credit market is over $50 trillion. So if Bernanke goes out there and prints another $1 trillion, what is that? 1/50th of the amount that's out there. Then he's done this actually 2-3 times over, but none of it made its way into the economy. Most of that sat out there as excess reserves at the Fed, or this is also the way Bernanke has financed the U.S. deficit. Now, that, of course, is expansionary. It's net inflationary, it's inflationary, but the net effect of all of this, if you actually look at credit contraction, credit declined in the Great Recession, and it's now climbing back up a little bit, but most of that credit is student loans, which is actually a deflationary phenomenon. We're making debt slaves out of students graduating from college with no job, or when they get a job, they're not making enough to pay those loans back. Their wages are being garnished. They're moving back in to their house, to their parents' houses. All of these things are deflationary forces. Bernanke's been trying like mad to overcome them. I predicted that he wouldn't be able to do that. And certainly look at home prices. They're now finally starting to go back up, but just, barely in relationship to the amount that they've crashed. All of these things are things that I said would happen and did. And the only thing I did differently than the rest of the Austrians is say, you know what? Credit is more important here than money supply.
Now, one of the tools he could use is he's got all these excess reserves building up in Washington there in the Federal Reserve. Do you think he could, instead of giving the banks a little bit of interest to hold excess reserves, do you think he could start charging them to hold excess reserves to force that money out into the economy?
Could he? He certainly could. I mean, would he? If you look at what they're doing, Bernanke has slowly been recapitalizing banks over time by pumping all of this money out there and paying them interest on excess reserves. So if he were, and I don't believe that banks are fully capitalized here yet, certainly in accord with the new Basel standards, which of course they've postponed ad infinitum. They've also postponed, actually since 2007 when it was first supposed to go in, banks having to mark assets to market. Instead, we're using mark to fantasy prices. It's called level 3. Level 1 asset is something that's, got a known price like a stock. and a level 2 might be some kinds of bonds or illiquid assets, and level 3. And if you look at what's on the balance sheets of Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan, all these level 3 assets have actually been going up, increasing, and none of this stuff is marked to market. They've been able to get away with this. In other words, they're pretending these assets on the balance sheets are worth more than what they are. Well, they know they're not. I know they're not. You know they're not. Bernanke, by paying interest on excess reserves, is actually slowly recapitalizing these banks over time. So while he wants the banks to lend, I don't think he wants them to lend irresponsibly, and he also wants to keep helping these banks out over time. So while he could do that, I don't think it would spur lending if he did. Instead, it would be a charge to banks. So for that reason, I don't think he's going to do it.
If American banks start falling over, like kind of Lehman Brothers crisis, and then we get really rapid deflation as the kind of fractional reserve leverage money kind of collapses in on itself, do you think Mr. Bernanke could get into his helicopter and start flying around the country, dumping money from his printing press out of the window to try to stem this kind of hyper deflation?
He never really could ever do that in the first place. Technically, what Bernanke has been doing is, providing liquidity, and that's actually debt. Banks have to pay this back. Now, he did take some extremely loosey-goosey, as did the ECB, in terms of collateral. So he did play some funny games, and it's still going on in Europe right now with what constitutes a adequate collateral when on these swaps. But that money has to be paid back. It's not as if he can go out there and give it away. And various Fed governors have actually commented on this, that the Fed can provide liquidity and not capital. They just can't give money away. And more importantly, I don't think the Fed would do that even if they could. And the reason being, again, it would punish the banks. How would it punish the banks? Well, they would be being paid back in cheaper and cheaper and cheaper dollars. It would actually be bailing out the consumer at the expense of banks for that to happen. I don't think Bernanke really wants to bail out consumers. They don't want to give away money to have people just give it back to the banks. No, the idea here is to make people, debt slaves. Look at, some of the bankruptcy reform acts that passed in Congress in 2005. Made it difficult to walk away from student loans, made it difficult to do, all these kinds of things. And the Fed is the same way. They don't want the banks to be paid back with cheaper dollars. So I don't think he's just going to give money away to people. Might give money away or lend money cheaply to the banks, but that's a lot different than actually physically dropping money out of helicopters, something the Fed can't do, and I don't believe would do, even if they could. And what's interesting is Bernanke, just a couple of weeks ago, actually came out and said that he's essentially done everything that he has said that he could do in his great speech, deflation, making sure it doesn't happen here again. And where are we? They've still not revived the housing market. It's on life support from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the FHA. He's not revived credit other than student loans, which is making debt slaves out of people. So here he said, we've done everything, we've tried everything, and I look around and say, okay, this is what they've got to show for it. But the one thing that he did do, and I've actually not heard people talk about this, is by dumping all of this money, he did revive the corporate bond market. Companies were in danger of not having cash to run their businesses. They were high in debt. The liquidity that he provided, a lot of corporations, and I'm going to do a post on it actually very shortly, have gone out there and raised cash, and there's cash on the balance sheets of these corporations so that if there was another money crunch like we saw in 2007, well, actually, there won't be another money crunch like we saw in 2007 as long as these corporations keep that cash on hand. Now, bear in mind, that cash is really debt. They've gone out there, they've issued these bonds at amazingly low interest rates, whatever. So it's debt. And people go out there, you hear them say, oh my God, wait till all this cash comes back in the market, or what if this, cash starts chasing stocks? Well, the other side of that cash, as always, is debt. So that money's, in essence, spoken for, except that in a liquidity crisis, should we get another one like affected Lehman, that cash these corporations already have, they're sitting on, they can actually use that cash to fund their businesses for a while. So I think we've prevented, or Bernanke, the one thing he has done is prevent this liquidity crisis like we've seen, as long as corporations don't go out there and spend that cash, leaving only the debt. Then we would get back in that situation again. However, what Bernanke has done, actually, in this, is created a bubble in the junk bond markets, the bubble in the corporate bond markets, certainly by driving interest rates as low as he has. We've got I'm now willing to say, a bubble in the treasury market, but just as happened with Japan, these bubbles can last a fair amount of time before they burst. Burst they will, I just don't know when.
Doug Casey thinks that we're in the eye of a hurricane because of all this money printing, and that we're about to, at some point, go into the trailing edge of a huge financial hurricane. What do you think is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years?
I don't think we're going to see much different here in the next 2 or 3 years. I said about, 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago maybe, actually, yeah, all the way back in 2005 when people were calling for hyperinflation, I said, you're way too early. Actually, I don't think it's going to happen at all, but certainly were it to happen, I thought that was way too early, that we would get deflation first, and we did. We actually got deflation almost no matter how you use the term. We actually had falling prices, not for very long, but it happened. We certainly had a collapse in credit only if one looked at money supply alone. Could a case be made that we were still in a period of inflation? And as I said, I believe I've proven here now that aspect of it, that looking at money supply alone was the wrong way of looking at things. Certainly from a real world perspective, we've seen, my view play out. So what's going to happen in the next few years? Is anything dramatic going to change? I don't see so. If anything, we're seeing too much U.S.-centric focus here on what the Fed is doing, when what the ECB is doing, and with all the target level reserves in the ECB and the LTRO and the situations in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and the deterioration in France. We now have Japan in on the act, and certainly if one wants to look at where inflation is highest in terms of credit growth, it's actually been in China, where, money supply and credit has been expanding at a phenomenal pace. Credit expansion in China is the one place in the world where credit really is expanding. So, for people to look in isolation at what Bernanke has done, predicting high inflation or hyperinflation in the U.S., well, they've missed the global picture. The U.S. dollar can only fall against the yen, or against the yuan, or against the British pound if the Fed is doing something different than the rest of the central banks in the world. And they're not. So, one of the beneficiaries of all of this, and we've certainly seen it since 2000, is you've got to deflate versus something, and who's the beneficiary of that? The beneficiary of that has been gold. This explains why I have been a deflationist, yet a deflationist unlike Prechter, who happens to like gold. I said, well, all these central banks are going to do it. It's not just the United States. What's the one asset that people can turn to that's going to hold on to the value? That asset is gold.
Yeah, James Turk of Gold Money, he recently predicted a fair value for gold of $11,000. And I was speaking to Professor Patrick Barron of Iowa recently as well, and he thought that the fair value of gold might even be $38,000. What do you think the fair value of gold should be or will get to?
I don't know, and then those are two different questions, aren't they? What's the fair value and where will it get to? I think if you did and I'm guessing here, that the $38,000 came from a mathematical model of if we took all the currency out there, all the credit out there, I think it would have to be credit too. Did he do credit?
Yes, it was U.S. gold reserves divided by the M3 figure.
Yeah. So M3 is a distorted figure, but let's just use M3. That's what you would come to. You would come to a completely different number if you used M2, and another number if you used M1. How did James arrive at his 11,000?
Oh, he has a fair value kind of index. I'm not entirely sure of the details, but it's all available on the Gold Money website for anyone who is interested. But he says it is about 11,000, and he's put that up from a figure because of the recent money printing.
The 11, in terms of what's doable, how high we can get, I think 11,000 is certainly possible. But 11,000 on gold, from let's say where are we at here now. So let's just roughly call it 2,000. To go from 2,000 to 11,000, if you did that over a number of years, that certainly one might say is high rate of inflation, but it would not certainly be what anyone would call hyperinflation. Now, if it happened in a year, I suppose, but then then there's other questions. How does it get there, and what does the government do to it? One of my big fears here, Andrew, is that I don't think the governments are going to confiscate gold again like FDR did in the 30s. But one thing they might do is just literally tax the hell out of it. Let's say gold doubles or triples in price from here. Would it be beyond the government to say, you know what? We're gonna tax you on all the gold you're holding. Certainly, they want to know what you're doing with it, how much you have. You got to fill out these forms. You got to, let them know. You're supposed to let them know if you're holding any assets overseas, not just gold, but gold or silver or stock markets in general. The governments are making it extremely hard, to protect yourself. So, I don't know the answer to that one, and if it gets that high, is there going to be a forced swap for cash? Not physically, but maybe via taxation. So I don't know. Certainly, 11,000 seems like a doable thing, but I certainly wouldn't put a time frame on it. I would never say, that it's going to get that high within the next 2 or 3 years. In fact, I would say it's not going to get there in the next 2 or 3 years, and maybe 2,400 or 3,000 or something in the next 2 or 3 years might be a more realistic kind of target.
Yeah, they could apply a windfall tax, couldn't they? They could say, you gold bugs, you've been very naughty, you've got this undeserved windfall profit, so that might make it useful to get your gold overseas. Now, the US, you don't expect a big bang end to the current situation. It might go on for some years. That seems to be the same track as what the Japanese have been going down for 20 years. Now, today, the new Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Shinzo Abe, he declared a bold monetary regime change and open-ended central bank asset purchases, which I thought would be nice for one of your phrases, which was to infinity and beyond. He was also pleased to announce that he'd forced the supposedly independent Bank of Japan to go for a 2% price inflation target. Now, Japan has been using these kinds of Keynesian tactics now for 20 years. Do you think that this new 2% Japanese inflation target will do the Japanese any good, or could it do them even more harm?
Oh, it absolutely cannot do them any good. And this is one of these cases where you'd better be careful for what you get. Certainly, they did a poll recently in Japan, and like 80%, and I'm not sure whether it was people or businesses that responded, maybe a combination, actually thought that rising prices would be a bad thing. So here you've got an aging demographic. You got people that want to save, that need to save, and the government is actually physically out to destroy their currency. It's a mad world. So when people, look at, the United States and say, my God, we're going to get hyperinflation. I said in 2005 that hyperinflation was likely to come to Japan first, and people thought I was freaking out of my mind when I made that statement. Well, here we are now, and there is a genuine risk in Japan that they might very well destroy this currency. So far, however, it's been a case of all talk. Japan has said these kinds of things before. Is a 2% inflation target, is that mean anything? What if they said 10%? Well, it only means something if they actually go out there and do it. You can set whatever inflation target you want, but if you're just not willing to back it up with action, it's not going to do anything. And so far, with that 1% inflation target, they've not been willing to back it up and do anything. What's different this time, however, is the Prime Minister of Japan has actually said, you know what? If the central bank doesn't do this, if the Bank of Japan doesn't do this, we're going to go out there, we're going to replace those guys, and we're going to put someone in there that's going to do it. Now, what's different is you have politicians getting into the act, demanding what the central bank is going to do. That is an enormous difference. If they act through, the yen can plunge here. And so looking for a currency that can plunge, I think it's the yen. Now, the debate right now is, are they really going to follow through? Is the Bank of Japan going to do this? Is this guy just squawking, or is he a genuine nutcase? I believe he's a genuine nutcase. That still doesn't mean he follows through, but it means that he's got the potential to. And this is kind of one of these things where, once it gets started, it may be hard to stop. So we'll see. But certainly within the next few years, there's more chance of a currency blow up in Japan, or perhaps in Europe as well, if Spain, if Greece, if the problems there translate into those countries leaving the eurozone, which I think is likely to happen. So the U.S. is going to be relatively sheltered from that stuff, at least in the short to intermediate term. So those looking for hyperinflation in the United States, in the U.S. dollar, are likely to be as wrong in the next 3 years as they were in the last 7 or 8. It's just not going to happen.
Now, I'd like to wave a magic wand at this point, and I'd like to make you the governor of the Bank of Japan, or even better, I'd like to put Ron Paul into the White House, and I'd like to make you the Federal Reserve Governor. If you were in those positions, what would you do to solve these crises?
Well, the first thing I would do is fire myself. Seriously, we don't need a Fed. Actually, it would be a little bit more than that. I don't think you can end the Fed big bang here like that, but I would want to put into place a mechanism to end fractional reserve lending, say over a period of 10 years. And try and figure out the best way to do that. Get the Fed out of the money printing business. Certainly we could do that, right now. I don't think you could drain all of those reserves, in a flash and get to a full 100% gold-backed dollar, something that James Turk, all the Austrians would agree on, in fact, here. That's, what I would do. I don't think we can do it big bang. I don't know the appropriate number of years, but essentially my big mission would be, to put this plan in place and fire myself. So, yes, I was actually being very serious.
And let the free market work.
And let the free market work. That is exactly correct. There's some other interesting things here happening in terms of the U.S. dollar. I talked about it in a recent post. where I was talking about robots, and I did a post that, meet Baxter. He's out to get your minimum wage job. And we're seeing manufacturing actually return back to the United States. It's just not going to people. It's going to robots. We're able to, produce stuff here without the risk of China stealing our technology, without the costs of shipping goods across the Pacific in an era of peak oil, where it's going to be at some point very expensive to do that. So if we can get a robot that lasts, X number of hours and essentially does all of this work and we've priced this thing out at like $3 an hour, now it's competing with Japanese laborers who are working for $3 an hour. In the U.S., we're doing it here with robots. Well, what does that do? I mean, we took a job away from China, so there's going to be some political strife in China as a result of that. But we've not given a job back here in the United States. However, what we've done is help the U.S. balance of trade. That is actually U.S. dollar positive, something I did not mention in my post, and I'm going to do a follow-up on that. So we have some things happening here with the yen, with China, with robots that are actually U.S. dollar net positive. So, that's a good thing. In my opinion, it might not be to Bernanke. It's certainly not to all these central banks that are all out to debase their currencies. And let's face it, we're in the midst of a global currency war right now. The U.S. manufacturers are complaining right now, have filed a trade complaint against Toyota and against what Japan is doing, which would cheapening the yen. And we've seen recent talk out of the ECB from what's this guy's name, Herman Van Rompuy, who is complaining that the value of the euro is too high. We've got all these politicians, all these central bankers, all trying to debase currency at the same time. Once again, the beneficiary of this is gold. They're all doing the same thing. Another reason why hyperinflation here in Japan over the course of hyperinflation in the U.S. over the course of the next few years is just simply an unrealistic thing.
Now, most Austrians would say the rise of technology is a good thing, such as, the rise of trucking saved people carrying things on their backs from New York to Chicago because it releases people to better, more highly valued human tasks. Now, speaking of China, they've had a long time kind of money and even bigger credit expansion, building all these ghost cities and funding all of the sorts of other malinvestments. Do you think that we're near to a Chinese Austrian-style bust? And if you don't think that yet, do you think that this Chinese bust will come soon?
Absolutely. I think whether you call it a bust or rebalancing or whatever, I think, the whole global economy is in a state of rebalancing here now. People carry these trends forward and they think they last forever. Even just a couple of years back, the whole meme was you need to buy commodities because China's going to use them more and more and more and more and more, every year at an increasing rate, in perpetuity. Well, things don't last into perpetuity. Certainly if they did as a result of peak oil, we're talking about a situation where there simply isn't enough. We would be, if China continued its infrastructure growth, at the same pace that it has, eventually there's going to be a global conflict over oil. And there might still be one anyway, but more realistically speaking, China has all these malinvestments of which you spoke. It's going to need to rebalance. It's going to have to slow down. It's going to stop building all these houses, stop all this infrastructure. It has more than ample infrastructure, buildings. It's got the world's largest mall, and it's vacant. It's got entire cities that are vacant. So what's that going to do to the price of commodity when China stops that model? Well, I'll tell you what. I don't know about oil because of peak oil, but certainly for base metals, the price of copper is likely to crash. Who is going to be the beneficiary from that? Actually, I think we all benefit from that, but it's going to be most painful for certain aspects of the Chinese economy, and it's actually likely to be a good thing for the U.S., especially if manufacturing is coming back here, and the price of raw materials sinks on top of it. Again, this is probably U.S. dollar net support, a factor that one would look at, in isolation and say that this should benefit the U.S. dollar. People aren't looking at these things. They only look at the Fed in isolation. In isolation, what the Fed is doing certainly is horrific. But it's horrific across the board, as I've said. But yes, the big bust is coming in China. I think people are going to be, shocked by it. There was a debate in the Economist magazine where Michael Pettis at China Financial Markets took one side of the argument, saying that, no, China is not about to pass the U.S. in GDP anytime soon. And the Economist said, well, it's going to happen by 2017. I side with Pettis. I think, and perhaps the word implode is the wrong word, but certainly to fall, say, from the 11% growth that China has had back down to, 1 or 2% for the rest of the decade, which I think is something that's going to happen, is an amazing plunge, and the ramifications of that are very huge. They're not felt yet, and they're coming.
Now, we've looked across the Pacific from the United States. So again, trying to look outside the United States, let's cross the Atlantic. Now, we've mentioned Mr. Van Rompuy, but recently Mr. Barroso, the President of the European Commission, told us that everything was well with the euro and the eurozone and that we should all move along. What do you think of these claims that we should all move along?
Well, everything's not well. Let's start there, and move along to what? Look and tell me what problems they've actually solved over there. They've fixed the symptom. They've not fixed any problems at all. The symptom was massively rising interest rates in Greece, then followed by Spain, Portugal, Ireland, whatever. So they're declaring victory by, curing the symptom, sort of like, declaring, victory when you cut off your left foot because you're towing. They've not fixed any of the underlying problems at all. The underlying problems are still there, and a massively inefficient, amazing bureaucratic nightmare of a structure that constitutes the EU. And I call it the nannycrats, who are the officials like, Van Rompuy and Barroso, and the zone itself I refer to as the nanny zone. They want to take the one thing that Ireland is doing correct, which has a low corporate tax rate structure that is the only reason why Ireland is reviving here, the Irish economy is reviving at all, is this lower corporate tax rate structure, and the rest of the EU is mad as hell at Ireland for having it. It's the only thing they've got. They don't want to give it up. They're trying to force Ireland into giving that up. Meanwhile, look at what Iceland did. Iceland just said, to hell with all of you guys. We're going to default. We're going to take our punishment. We're going to let the banks take their punishment. And the Icelandic economy is actually recovering far better than anyone, except the Austrians, of course, predicted. We got that one right, yet these clowns running the EU still can't see it. They want more and more rules. President Francois Hollande wants to make it impossible for French companies to fire workers. So what does that do? Well, if they can't fire workers, they're not going to hire them in the first place. So France is marching along with some incredibly inane constructs. Meanwhile, the Italian economy is imploding. The Spanish economy is imploding. 26.6 inflation, unemployment rate in Spain, 56% youth unemployment. That's a direct result of these policies that says you can't get rid of people. Is anyone going out there and fixing the policies? No. They're trying to paper this all over with cheaper interest rates. Spain actually wanted to do something. They lowered the VAT, which is actually a very good thing. We need to lower taxes here, not raise them. The EU filed a complaint because Spain wasn't charging enough VAT on medical supplies and medical products. Now, here we are, all that unemployment. They want to lower taxes to help people that need medicines and medical supplies, and the EU comes along and says, sorry, Charlie, you can't do that. So, my question for Cameron is, why the hell would you want to ever put up with any of this stuff? With all the tariffs on garlic, with all the rules on that are undoubtedly coming down the pike on energy. And these politicians in the EU never get rid of a bad idea once they latch onto it. The financial transaction tax is going to come unless Cameron is willing to put this thing to a vote and just say, we don't benefit. And they don't. The UK, it's a mirage. The UK does not benefit from, any of these EU structures. People act and believe, the Keynesians think, oh my God, we would have to renegotiate all of these treaties. Well, why would they? The world goes on. The U.S. isn't going to renegotiate all of its treaties with Europe. And Switzerland is getting along quite fine, thank you, without being in the EU. So, politicians have overstated the fears, as they always do, fear-mongering, trying to get the UK to go in line with all of these inane rules. Now, imagine if the UK was in the eurozone and had to adopt its one-size-fits-all interest rate policy. What a mess the UK would be in right now. And that's what the debate ought to be going on. Cameron ought to have the decency. Actually, he ought to have the decency. If he wants the UK to stay in the EU, he ought to go out there and at least have the decency to make the case for it. Instead, he wimps out and says, you know what, we're going to vote on this in 5 years. I'm sorry, that's ludicrous. So, he should put this thing to a referendum, take a side, make a passionate plea one way or another. I'll make the passionate plea, as people before me, Nigel Farage at the UKIP, for saying let's just walk away from this EU while we still can. But at least you ought to have the decency to go out there and say, you know what, we're going to put this to a vote right now, rather than pretending they're going to have a vote in 5 years. Ridiculous.
Well, as somebody living in the UK, Cameron just seems like somebody who's interested in remaining Prime Minister for as long as he possibly can, and to heck with the consequences. Do you think that, even though he's put off his speech and he's going to actually make it tomorrow, do you think there's anything he can do to prevent the UK's kind of slide into kind of financial Armageddon?
Well, again, look at the problems that that actually the United States, Spain, Europe all have. We've got a bloated union structure, and I don't know a lot about the UK other than my perception here is the UK's problem with the unions is even greater than the United States' problems with unions. So until you address some of these fundamental problems, of course, the UK is going to, keep having these kinds of problems. I'll ask you a question. Is my perception here that the UK's problems with unions is at least as big as the one we have here in the U.S.? I think I'm correct on that, or are you going to take the other side?
It's not quite as bad as it was in the 1970s, and it's probably not as bad as the French situation, which has made Gerard Depardieu defect to Russia. But it is pretty bad. I think people here feel that they have a job for life when they get a job, and that employers are just people who should be exploited and taken advantage of. Anyway, I'm the interviewer. I shouldn't be answering any questions. It's been fantastic talking to you today, and this is the longest interview I've ever done. It's been absolutely fabulous. is there any way our Gold Money Foundation listeners can follow your thoughts and views?
Yes, certainly. I write a blog, and it's called Mish's Global Economic Trend Analysis. But the easy way to find me is to just do a Google search for Mish, M-I-S-H. It's catchy, easy to remember. I came across it actually by accident. It's just the first two characters of my first and last name. And so do a Google search for Mish, tune into my blog. I write about gold, silver, interest rates, the global economy, and recently a lot about Spain and Europe and Japan, because right now that's where the action is. And I think the crisis is going to hit Europe, Japan, before it hits the U.S., but that doesn't mean that the U.S. doesn't have its day of reckoning coming, because we do. We cannot keep on having $1 trillion deficits year in, year out without there being a price to pay. The question is when that price is to be paid, and I'm going to take the other side of the argument against the hyperinflationists of that. It's still not. It's further away than 2 or 3 years down the road before our crisis hits.
I know you've got some blog posts to write, and it's 4 degrees Fahrenheit there, so you need to write hard to keep yourself nice and warm. So thank you very much for your time, Mish.
It's a pleasure to be on the show, Andrew, and I hope we have a chance to do this again.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our Gold Research section.